I'm Ruth Easton. I'm 57 years old. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where my own father told me the Army was no place for a girl. I went on to wear 4 stars as one of the most senior generals in the country. For 35 years, I let my work speak instead of my voice. I never once raised it to demand the respect I had earned. But when a colonel at a black tie gala looked right past me, called me sweetheart, and sent me to wait with the aides, the truth caught up with him in a way I never could have staged. The morning of the gala, my dress uniform hung on the back of the closet door. The 4 stars on each shoulder caught the gray light coming through the window. I stood there longer than I needed to, the way a person does when a day already feels heavier than the calendar says it should. Rain was coming. I could smell it through the screen, and underneath the quiet of that morning was a feeling I had carried for 35 years, the feeling of a woman who has spent a lifetime being told to wait in the smaller room. By that evening, a colonel I had never met would look right past me and send me there again. I want to tell you everything that came before it, every year of it, so that you understand why, when he did it, I simply said, "Of course," and stepped back into the hallway. I did not correct him. I did not raise my voice. I had learned a long time ago that the truth does not need me to argue for it. It only needs me to outlast the people who get it wrong. To understand the gate, you have to go back to a kitchen table in Ohio. I grew up in a house where my father worked the line at a parts plant and believed the world was arranged in a sensible order that a person was foolish to question. Harold Easton was not a cruel man. He coached my brother's baseball teams and fixed the neighbors' cars for free and never once raised a hand to anyone. He simply knew, the way some men know things without ever examining them, that certain doors were not built for his daughter. I was 16 the night I told him I wanted to go to West Point. My mother had made a pot roast, and the smell of it is one of those memories that stays attached to a moment for the rest of your life. I said the words out loud, and my father set down his fork and looked at me with something close to tenderness, which somehow made it worse. "The Army's no place for a girl, Ruthie," he said. "You'll be home by Christmas." He did not say it to wound me. He said it the way you tell a child the stove is hot. My mother did not argue with him at the table. But that night she came into my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and told me she had filled out the request for my congressional nomination herself and mailed it that afternoon. She did not make a speech. She just squeezed my hand once and turned off the light. That was the first time I understood something that would shape the next 3.5 decades of my life. Some people decide who you are before you ever open your mouth. You cannot argue them out of it. You can only outlast them. I went to West Point in the fall of 1987. I will not pretend it was easy. I was cold and exhausted and homesick, and there were mornings I lay in my bunk and heard my father's voice telling me I would be home by Christmas. The only thing that got me up was a stubbornness I had inherited, ironically, from him. I graduated and was commissioned a second lieutenant in 1991. My father came to the ceremony in a suit that was a little too tight. When he shook my hand, he told me quietly that he still thought I would quit within a year. I did not argue. I had stopped arguing with him by then. I just kept showing up. I chose aviation because the first time I sat in a cockpit, something in me went still and certain in a way nothing else ever had. Flight school was where I met a captain named Frank Delaney, one of my instructors, the first man in a uniform who looked at me and saw an officer instead of a problem to be managed. He was hard on me, harder than he was on the men, but it was the hardness of someone who has already decided you belong and refuses to let you waste it. On a rough training flight late in the program, weather coming in, I brought the aircraft down clean while my hands wanted to shake. Frank was quiet for a moment in the headset. Then he said something I have carried into every command I have ever held. "You don't fly like someone trying to prove something. You fly like someone who already knows." Hold on to that. I did not know it then, but that sentence was the whole map of my career. I would spend the next 34 years in rooms full of people who assumed I was trying to prove something. And the thing that carried me through every one of them was the quiet certainty Frank named on that flight. I already knew. I did not have to convince anyone. I just had to keep flying. People assume that rank fixes the problem. They think if you climb high enough, the assumptions stop, that somewhere above the clouds there's a line you cross after which no one mistakes you for the help. I am here to tell you that is not how it works. I pinned on 4 stars and people still handed me their coats. The first time I remember it clearly, I was a major deployed to Iraq in 2003, running the air operation for a task force. A delegation of civilian officials flew in to be briefed. The lead man looked at me, then passed me and handed me his jacket and his sunglasses without a word, the way you hand things to a coat check. I took them. I hung the jacket on the hook by the door. Then I walked to the front of the room, picked up the laser pointer, and briefed them on the air operation they had crossed an ocean to understand. I watched it land on his face about 30 seconds in. The slow horror of a person realizing the coat check was the major running the show. That night, I sat with Sandra Okafor, my classmate from West Point, deployed a few tents over. She poured 2 cups of coffee that tasted like a battery and asked the question she always asked. "Doesn't it make you furious?" "It used to," I told her. "Now I just let the room figure it out on its own." It always does. Sandra shook her head. She thought I was too patient. That one day my patience would meet a moment that deserved something louder. One day, she said, someone is going to do it in front of the wrong crowd at the wrong time, and you are going to enjoy not saying a word. I laughed and told her I would let her know. The years went by the way years do in a career like mine, in a blur of moves and deployments and commands. I took a battalion of helicopters to Afghanistan as a lieutenant colonel. I commanded a combat aviation brigade as a colonel. I pinned on my first star in 2016, my second in 2019, my third in 2022. And at every single level, without fail, there was a moment when a stranger looked at me and decided I was someone's assistant. A 4-star general once asked me to refill his water glass at a conference because he assumed I was staff. A senator's aide tried to wave me out of a secure room I was about to brief in. A young officer at a reception asked me whose wife I was. I refilled the glass. I showed the aide my badge. I told the young officer I was nobody's wife, I was the division commander, and watched him want to disappear into the floor. None of it made me angry anymore. It had stopped being an insult and become a kind of weather. Something that happened regardless of how high I climbed, like rain that did not care about my rank. In the spring of 2025, I pinned on my 4th star and took command of Army Forces Command, the largest command in the Army, responsible for hundreds of thousands of soldiers. I was the first woman to hold the post. At the change of command ceremony, a reporter found me afterward and asked whose idea it had been to put, in her words, a female face on the command. She did not ask about my 34 years. She did not ask about Iraq or Afghanistan or the soldiers I had buried. I answered her with my record, because that is the only answer I have ever trusted. Sandra, retired by then, was in the audience. She caught my eye and shook her head, slow. I knew exactly what she was thinking, because she had said it to me in a plywood tent 22 years before. The wrong crowd, the wrong moment, and the pleasure of not saying a word. I did not know it yet, but that moment was a little more than a year away. The gala was held in a hotel ballroom downtown, one of those grand old rooms with chandeliers the size of small cars and carpet that swallowed the sound of your footsteps. It was the anniversary celebration of the Aviation Association, and Frank Delaney, my old flight instructor, now retired with 4 stars of his own and serving as the association's president, had asked me months earlier to be the guest of honor. I had said yes before he finished the sentence. I have a habit my detail finds mildly maddening. I like to arrive early and quietly, before the noise and the receiving lines. So I came in a side entrance about 40 minutes before the reception was set to begin, my protective detail staging outside per my preference. It was raining hard by then, and I had a dark evening cape over my shoulders against the weather, the kind a woman wears over dress blues, so the rain does not ruin the wool. It happened to cover my shoulders completely. It happened to cover the 4 stars. The corridor outside the principal's reception room was bright and busy with the particular chaos that precedes a formal event. Standing at the door with a clipboard and a printed seating chart was a colonel I had never met. His name, I would learn, was Preston Gaines. He was the event chairman, the officer in charge of running the reception, managing who went where. His uniform was perfect, and he was looking down at his seating chart the way some men look at a phone, as a way of not having to look at the people in front of them. I stepped toward the reception room door. He did not look up. He registered a woman approaching, a woman in a dark cape with no visible rank, a woman he did not recognize, and filed her instantly into the only category his evening had room for. Aides wait down the hall, sweetheart. Eyes on the chart, pen moving. This room is principals only. One of the staffers beside him, a sergeant first class, started to say something. Gaines talked right over her, the way he had probably talked over people his entire career. Down the hall. Thank you. He waved his pen toward the anteroom without ever lifting his eyes. Now I want you to understand the choice I made in that second, because it is the heart of this whole story. I could have dropped the cape from my shoulders. I could have let the 4 stars catch the light and watched the color drain out of his face right there. Sandra would have. A younger version of me might have. But I am 57 years old, and I have spent a lifetime learning that the loudest thing in any room is the truth, and the truth never needs my help. So I did the thing I have always done. Of course, I said, and I turned and walked down the hall to wait with the aides. The anteroom was small and warm and smelled like coffee from a cart in the corner. A young second lieutenant named Grace Albright was standing very straight against the wall, terrified of doing something wrong on what was clearly one of the biggest nights of her young career. She kept smoothing the front of her uniform and checking a list she had already checked. I sat down in one of the folding chairs along the wall and watched her for a moment. I saw a younger version of myself so clearly it almost hurt. Breathe, I told her gently. Nobody here is as important as their acting. She gave me a small, grateful, panicked laugh. She thought I was a fellow aide, an older woman from some office staff, here to ferry name cards. She had no idea. The guest of honor, the 4-star commander of the largest army in the world, the woman whose name was printed at the top of Colonel Gaines's own seating chart, was sitting in a folding chair among the staff because a man with a clipboard could not be bothered to raise his eyes. I thought about Sandra and the prophecy she had made over battery acid coffee in a plywood tent. The wrong crowd. The wrong moment. Here it was. Finally, the moment she had promised me, and the only thing required of me was to do nothing at all. It took about 10 minutes for the rest of my detail to come in out of the rain. Master Sergeant Dominic Reyes had been the lead of my protective detail for the better part of a year. A calm, square-shouldered man who wore a dark suit and an earpiece and missed nothing. When the building was cleared to his satisfaction, he came looking for his principal. He stepped into the anteroom doorway, scanned the room once, and found me in the folding chair. Something flickered across his face. A quick professional recalculation of how I had ended up there. Then it was gone, replaced by the flat courtesy he always used on the job. "Ma'am," he said, "we're ready for you." Grace Albright's head turned. The other aides went quiet. Reyes keyed his radio, said a few low words, and 2 more members of the detail came through the corridor and moved toward the principal's reception room, the room I had been turned away from 10 minutes earlier. What happened next, I did not orchestrate. I want to be honest about that. It is simply what a protective detail does when the principal moves. Reyes walked into the reception room ahead of me, and his voice, when it came, was level and carrying and left no room for discussion. "Clear the floor. The general is moving." The detail spread out, easing guests back toward the walls to open a path. Conversation died. The clink of glasses stopped, and Colonel Preston Gaines, standing near the center of the room with his clipboard, found a member of my detail stepping up beside him, a hand settling on his shoulder, guiding him firmly out of the way. I stepped into the doorway. I reached up and unclasped the cape. I let it fall from my shoulders into the waiting hand of one of my detail, and the 4 stars on each shoulder caught the light of those enormous chandeliers. I watched it cross Gaines's face. I saw the exact moment the woman in the cape, the aide he had sent down the hall, the sweetheart he could not be bothered to look at, became the 4-star guest of honor whose name sat at the top of his own seating chart. The color went out of him. His mouth opened and found nothing to say. The hand on his shoulder was still there, holding him gently to the side, while the room he had been so proud to control reorganized itself entirely around a woman he had dismissed without a glance. I did not look at him. I want you to understand that too, because it was the most deliberate thing I did all night. Looking at him would have made it about him, and it was never about him. I walked through the path my detail had opened, and across the room I saw Frank Delaney, 71 years old and grinning like a boy, crossing toward me with his arms out. "There she is," he said, and folded me into an embrace. And the whole room understood at once exactly who had been sitting with the aides. Frank told me afterward that the silence was the strangest part, the way 100 conversations stopped at once. The way people who had been laughing a moment before set down their glasses and watched a path open across the carpet for a woman they had not noticed arrive. He said you could see the calculation move through the crowd, person by person, as they realized what they were watching. And then he said the part I have thought about many times since. He said the only person who did not seem surprised was an old retired sergeant working the coat room, who looked at the 4 stars and at Gaines's white face and nodded once, slowly, like a man watching the weather finally do what he had known it would do all along. That sergeant understood the whole thing better than anyone in that ballroom. He had been the one taking the coats. He knew exactly how the room treated the people who take the coats. Later that night, alone in my hotel room, I felt the thing I always feel after these moments. Not triumph. Something quieter and more tired than that. I thought about my father at the kitchen table. I thought about all the coats I had hung up over 34 years. And I understood, the way you understand a thing you have always known, that I had spent my whole life proving a small, quiet point to people who were never really looking, and that the proving had never once made me feel the way they imagined it would. My phone rang. It was Sandra. "You didn't say a word, did you?" It was not really a question. I didn't have to, I told her. That was the whole point. She was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, soft and low. The laugh of a friend who had predicted this exact night in a plywood tent 22 years before. "I told you," she said. "The wrong crowd, the wrong moment, and you enjoyed not saying a word." I did. God help me. After a lifetime of patience, I did. The apology came faster than I expected, and in exactly the wrong shape. Colonel Gaines found me near the end of the evening, his face a careful arrangement of contrition. I could tell before he opened his mouth that the apology he had rehearsed was not really an apology to me. It was an apology to his own career. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. If I'd known who you were, I never would have..." I let him get that far, and then I stopped him. "That's the problem, Colonel," I said. "You should not have to know who someone is to treat them like a person." He blinked. I do not think anyone had said anything like that to him in a very long time. I did not file a complaint. I did not call his commander demanding his head. I have seen too many careers ended over a single bad night, and I did not believe one rude moment at a doorway should erase decades of service. But I did not let him off the hook with a warm word and a pat on the arm either, because that would have taught him nothing. And a man who learns nothing simply does it again to someone who cannot drop a cape and reveal 4 stars. I told him plainly that every person in that room had seen how he treated a woman he believed was nobody. I told him he was responsible for the room he ran, and that the way he ran a doorway said more about him than any evaluation ever would. I told him I hoped he would spend real time thinking about who he waved off when he assumed no one important was watching, because those were the moments that revealed a man, not the moments when the stars were in plain sight. The consequence, when it came, did not come from me at all. Brigadier General Neil Dunwoody, my chief of staff, had been in that ballroom and had seen the whole thing unfold from 20 feet away. He pulled Gaines aside before the night was over. I was not there for it, but Neil told me the shape of it afterward. He told Gaines in plain words that this was not about embarrassing a 4-star. I was the last person in the building who needed defending. It was about a pattern. It was about what Neil had now seen with his own eyes, exactly how Preston Gaines treated people he believed had nothing to offer him. "She's not the one you have to worry about, Preston," Neil told him. "It's everyone you've ever talked to like that when the stars weren't in the room." That sentence did what mine could not. It took the comfortable story Gaines had been telling himself, the story where he had simply made an unlucky mistake about one important person, and replaced it with a much harder one. The story of a man whose default setting had finally been witnessed by someone who could not be charmed out of remembering it. I have thought about why Neil's words worked, when mine did not. An apology to the person you have wronged can always be discounted as politics, as the smart move. But Neil had nothing to gain. When a peer who owes you nothing tells you what he saw, plainly and without heat, there is nowhere left to hide. In the months that followed, Gaines's world quietly tightened. Not dramatically, no one relieved him or ended his career. But the assignments that had once seemed inevitable began drifting toward other people. The rooms he had always been welcome in grew a degree cooler. A man who had spent his whole life trading on access discovered that access is a currency that loses value the moment people decide you are not generous with it. He was not destroyed. He was simply finally accurately understood. For a man like Gaines, that may have been worse. About 3 weeks after the gala, I had my staff reach out and request that Second Lieutenant Grace Albright be detailed to my headquarters for a short mentoring rotation. When she arrived, standing very straight in my outer office, she still did not entirely understand what had happened that night, or that the older woman who had told her to breathe had been the guest of honor the whole time. I sat her down and told her the truth. All of it? I watched her piece it together. Then I told her why she was standing in my office. Because you were the only person in that anteroom who treated the people around you like they mattered. You were scared out of your mind, and you were still kind. I noticed. I always notice that. It is the rarest thing in this army, and it is the only thing I have ever found that actually predicts what kind of officer someone becomes. She did not know what to say. Over the weeks she spent around my headquarters, I watched something settle in her. A sense that the qualities she had been quietly worried made her too soft for this life were in fact the exact qualities that had brought her to the attention of a 4-star general. She started standing straight because she belonged, not because she was afraid. I gave her real work, not coffee runs. I put her in the corner of meetings where decisions were actually made, and I made her brief me, badly at first, then well, because the fastest way to teach a young officer she belongs in a room is to make her responsible for something in it. She made mistakes. I let her. The only one I corrected hard was the day she apologized for taking up my time. I told her, more sharply than I meant to, that she was never again to apologize for occupying a space she had earned, that there were enough people in the world ready to tell her she did not belong without her doing their work for them. Gaines, to his limited credit, began to change, slowly and against his own grain. I told him what I thought he should do. The Aviation Association ran a junior officer development program, the kind of unglamorous mentoring work that men like Gaines usually avoided because it offered no access and no shine. I told him I thought he should run it. The man whose entire failure had been a refusal to see junior people clearly should spend the next few years doing nothing but seeing them, learning their names, opening doors instead of guarding them. He could be sorry, or he could be useful. I told him I had always found useful to be the better of the two. To his credit, he took it. I heard later that he was good at it. The same obsessive attention to detail that had made him a tyrant at a doorway made him a genuinely careful mentor when pointed at the right target. People can surprise you if you give them a door instead of a sentence. Somewhere in those weeks, I drove out to see my father. Harold was 84 by then, slower, his big factory hands gone soft and spotted, his certainty worn down by the years the way a river wears down a stone. That afternoon, sitting on his porch with the same kind of rain coming that had come the night of the gala, I told him the story. The colonel, the cape, the anteroom, the 4 stars. He listened to the whole thing without a word. When I finished, he looked out at the rain for a long moment. Something moved in his face that I had been waiting most of my life to see. Then he reached over and put his soft old hand on top of mine. And for once in his life, Harold Easton did not tell me what I could not do. The rest came later, near the end of that summer, when he was failing, gently, the way a long day fades into evening. On one of those quiet afternoons, with no audience and nothing to prompt it, he said the thing he had not been able to say at the kitchen table in 1985, or at my commissioning, or at any of the ceremonies in between. "I was wrong about you, Ruthie," he said. "I was wrong from the start. I thought I was protecting you. I was just too small to see you." I had waited 35 years to hear some version of that. And the strange thing, the thing I did not expect, was that by the time it came, I no longer needed it. I had built a whole life without it. But needing a thing and being glad of it are two different matters. And I was glad of it all the way down. I told him he had not been too small. I told him he had taught me to outlast the people who got me wrong, and that he had been, in his own backwards way, the best teacher I ever had. Because he had gotten me wrong first and made me strong enough for everyone who got me wrong after. He laughed at that, a wet old laugh, and held my hand. We watched the light go down over the same Ohio fields where he had once told me the army was no place for a girl. I drove home that evening in the dark, and I cried a little on the highway, the first time in years. They were not sad tears exactly. They were the tears of a person setting down a weight she had carried so long she had stopped noticing it was heavy. For 35 years, some small stubborn part of me had been earning every star partly to prove a man at a kitchen table wrong. And now the man had said it himself. And the hollow that opened up where the proving used to be was not grief. It was room, space I could finally use for something other than the argument. The answer to what came next arrived the following spring at a commissioning ceremony where I had been asked to speak. For most of my career, when someone handed me a microphone, I had used it to talk about the mission, the soldiers, the work, anything but myself. I had spent a lifetime keeping my own story folded up small. But that morning, looking out at a few hundred brand new second lieutenants, all of them terrified and proud, I decided to do something I had never done. I decided to tell the truth. I did not tell them about the night a colonel sent me to wait with the aides, but I told them the lesson underneath it, the only part that ever mattered. I told them that some people in their careers would decide who they were before they opened their mouths. I told them it would happen when they were lieutenants, and it would still be happening when they were generals, because rank does not fix it, and stars on your shoulder do not stop a certain kind of person from looking straight through you. I told them they could not argue those people out of it, that they would waste years of their lives if they tried, that the only thing that ever actually worked was to do the work, keep showing up, and let the room catch up on its own time. The truth is the loudest thing in any room, and it never needs your help. It only needs your patience. I told them about the coats, not as a complaint, but as an inheritance I wanted to pass to them honestly. I told them they would be mistaken for the help and the spouse and the note-taker. That the temptation in those moments would be to announce themselves loudly, to produce their credentials, to make the room admit its mistake on the spot. I told them that temptation was natural and almost always wrong. The credential that matters is not the one on your shoulder. It is the one in your conduct, accumulated over years, until one day the room turns and sees the whole of you at once and wonders how it ever missed you. That kind of recognition cannot be demanded. It can only be earned and then waited for. And then I told them the second half, the half I think my father finally understood on that porch. I told them the goal was not to become the kind of person who finally gets the recognition they were denied. The goal was to become the kind of person who never denies it to anyone else. Every one of them would someday stand at a doorway holding a clipboard, with the power to decide whether the unknown person in front of them was worth their attention. And who they were in that moment, when they thought no one important was watching, was the only measure of an officer that had ever meant anything to me. I looked out at all those new gold bars catching the light the way my own had on a spring day in 1991 with my father in a suit that did not fit. And I thought about how many of those young officers would someday stand where I was standing. Grace Albright was in the audience that day, a lieutenant no longer terrified, carrying herself like someone who had decided she belonged. I recognized the posture because it was the one Frank Delaney had given me in a cockpit 34 years before. The thing he had handed me, I had handed her. That is the only kind of immortality I have ever believed in. Frank sat in the front row and beamed like the instructor he had always been to me. I named no one. I settled no scores. I just said the truest thing I knew and stepped back from the microphone. My father did not live to see that spring. But in his last good season, I had brought him a recording of an earlier talk. My mother told me later that he watched it twice, and that the second time, he turned to her and said that their daughter had turned out to be the best of all of them. June told me that the way you hand someone a gift you have been saving. I keep it where I keep the 4 stars. He was right, I think, in the end. Which is a strange thing to say about a man who spent my childhood being wrong about me. He was right that our family produced something good. He was just wrong for a long time about which one of us it would be, and about what good looks like, and about whether it could wear a uniform. People can be wrong for decades and still arrive, late and breathless, at the truth. I have made a career of betting on exactly that. So here's what I have come to believe after 35 years and one rainy night at a gala. There is a kind of revenge that is loud and fast and feels wonderful for about an hour and then leaves you exactly as empty as it found you. And there is something else, something quieter and slower and far more durable, which is simply to be seen at last, on your own terms, by people who finally bothered to look. I have had both. I promise you the second one is better. If they ever send you to wait with the aides, if a man with a clipboard ever looks straight through you and decides you are nobody, I want you to remember a 57-year-old woman in a dark cape who had 4 stars on her shoulders and said nothing at all. Go quietly, do your work, be kind to the frightened person in the chair beside you, and let the room catch up. It always does.